Third, the moral argument. So everyone knows right or wrong intuitively. Since the dawn of history, morality has governed all nations, right? Whether it be Middle East or the Americas or Korea or Africa or something like that. For example, we know that helping your neighbor is better than to eat your neighbor, right? However, is there something objectively wrong about certain behaviors? If there is, then what could be the foundation for this universal principle? So, there's a lot of misconceptions of what the moral argument is, okay? So I want to first get into what the moral argument is not. So, first, the moral argument is not saying that atheists cannot be moral people. It is not saying that, okay? It's not, okay? Obviously, there are moral atheists, okay? So it's not saying that, okay? Second, the question is not if we can recognize moral values without belief in God. So this is the most frequent objection. Like, people say, I can recognize whether something is right or wrong without belief in God, right? But that's not what we're saying. And what are we saying then, right? We'll get to that very soon. But next, the question is not if someone can create a system of ethics without reference to God. That's similar to the second one. Then we covered 3 ways the argument is not, but then what is? What is the argument? Okay? That's the question. The argument is that there is no philosophical starting point for the atheist to judge what is good or bad objectively. Does this make sense? There's nowhere they can start. There's nowhere they can point to ground objective morality. Belief in God is not necessary for objective moral values and duties. It is not necessary, okay? It is not necessary, right? However, the existence of God is necessary for objective moral values and duties. Is there any questions concerning this? Because this is a very critical point. It's not how we know morality, it's how we ground morality. That is the question. We're not saying that atheists can't be immoral people. Atheists can't be moral people, sorry. Obviously, there are moral atheists, and we can just see that all around. But we are asking a question of moral ontology, not moral epistemology, right? We are asking a question on how to ground morality, not how we know morality. So with that being said, yes, exactly. What does objective or subjective mean? Those are the terms that have been really floating around, right? So what does that mean? First, objective and subjective. And it's critical to understand this difference in order to understand the moral argument. So by objective, we just mean that something is right or wrong, regardless of someone else's opinion. It's something that transcends all cultures, all nations, all societies, and all languages, okay? So something, in this case, morality, right? A moral law that transcends all of these different cultures. By subjective, we just mean that it's based on or influenced by personal opinion, culture, or society. It's basically our opinion, whether it be personal or culturally, that's our opinion, or societally, that's our opinion. Okay? So is this difference, do you understand the difference? Yes. For example, let's say that there are, we'll get into examples of both actually, so yes. Let's say that there is 6 people, okay? So now let's say that these 5 guys, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy, they talk amongst one another and determine to steal, what's this guy's name? I guess Bob or something, Jim. Let's call him Jim, okay? They determine to steal Jim's money. So they beat him up and they steal the money. Okay? So, question. is the five's actions against the one objectively wrong or subjectively wrong? Again, what does objectively mean again? That it is universally wrong regardless of personal or cultural opinion. Right? That's what we just covered, right? Or is it subjectively wrong, right or wrong, relative to personal or cultural opinion? Does this distinction make sense? Yes. Okay, so we would say objectively wrong, right? But this is a very insignificant and not very helpful example, actually. So, but why do we ask? Why do we say that it is objectively wrong? So before we go on, let's raise the stakes of this example. Okay, let's raise the stakes. Let's extrapolate this principle of objective and subjective morality. Let's raise the stakes to a national level. We just focused on the individual level right now. And I guess if they were a family level. But let's go bigger and let's go nationally. Throughout the Second World War, and even before that, obviously, the Nazis committed crimes against humanity. These photos vividly illustrate the factory-level genocide that took place under their leadership. And you might not be able to see this photo here. This photo here are shoes, okay? Why is there shoes in a Nazi photo? Well, these shoes all represented someone that, what the Nazis would do is before they send them to the firing squad or the gas chambers or the furnaces, they would make all the people strip down so that the next, quote, batch that comes in, they could just reuse the clothes, okay? So they could further the war effort, saving money, okay, to win World War II, okay? So all these individual pairs of shoes represents someone. It represents a soul, right? It represents someone who had dreams and visions and plans and brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. All the individual pairs of shoes represent someone, right? Does this make sense? It represents someone. So, were the actions of the Nazis objectively wrong? What does that mean again? What does that mean? What does that mean? To say that it was objectively wrong is to say that it was still wrong even though the Nazis thought that it was right. Does this make sense? They think it's right? They want to further the Aryan race and create the ultimate specimen of mankind, right? The Aryan race. And it would, in an objective wrongness, it would still be wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and either murdered or brainwashed everybody so that everybody believed that what the Nazis did was actually right. On an objective sense, it would still be wrong, okay? Does that make sense? Because it transcends culture, nations, societies, languages, and these type of things, right? So it transcends the Nazis who thought it was right. And it would still be wrong even if they had won World War II. This makes sense, right? Does this make sense? Yes. Okay, great. So, what about the other side? Or were they right or wrong only subjectively? In other words, is it just our opinion that it is wrong, that they were wrong? Is it just from our enlightened American moral values that they were wrong? They were a Western power too, right? They produced some of the greatest musicians and philosophers and artists, and they were a very cultured and, quote, modern society. So is it just our opinion that they are wrong? Is it just from our personal, whether it be personal opinion or cultural opinion or societal opinion that they were wrong? Right? This is the question we're asking. What if they had won World War II? Would it be right then? Because then there's no more disagreement. Does that make sense? If they killed or brainwashed everybody, there would be no more disagreement. Everyone would think that the Holocaust was right. Right? So that would be subjectively wrong. It's just our opinion. Well, whose opinion is superior? In a subjective sense, no one's opinion is. It's just my opinion versus theirs. So, we ask the questions, are the atrocities that the Nazis committed, whether objectively wrong or subjectively wrong? Obviously, we would say objectively, right? Obviously. Right? And even those who are forced to say that it is only subjectively wrong because of their worldview, what their worldview entails. Even those who are forced to say that it is only subjectively wrong don't actually believe that. Here's why. Imagine I'm sitting in a subway, okay? And a guy walks in who believes that morality is just subjective. It's just my opinion or cultural opinion or societal opinion that something is wrong, okay? Everyone get the scenario over here, right? We are sitting in a subway. This guy walks in, okay? Imagine I go up to him and I punch him, okay? What is his natural reaction? He would get up and say, "Why did you do that? Your actions are wrong." Does that make sense? You would know that he does not believe in subjective morality by his reactions. Does that make sense? By his reaction, you can tell that this guy does not believe in subjective morality. Because what if I felt good about punching it, right? Whose opinion is superior? But notice that he appeals to a higher moral law that is universal, right? Say I come from a different culture, and he comes from another culture, right? He would still object that something is not right. He would appeal to a higher standard of morality. Does this make sense? So even those who quote unquote believe that there is only subjective morality don't actually believe that when you understand their reactions to what you just did, right? And the Nazis, what they did is on a level so much greater than just that minor harm that I did, right? Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So, of course, when we look upon the horrific genocide of the Nazis, and there's more examples, obviously, but we'll just stick to this example. Our moral compass tells us that something is objectively wrong. It doesn't just tell us, actually. It screams at us that something is objectively wrong, right? It practically screams at us. Excuse me, sorry. Okay. So we have established that there is an objective morality. But how would a non-theist, and there are many non-theists, right, like Buddhists or I don't know, some nomadic tribe or something, or atheists obviously fit into that category. How would a non-theist try to ground objective morality, objective moral values and duties? How would they try to ground this? Well, what about trying to ground morality, objective morality, in things like what promotes the well-being of conscious creatures through science? What if we tried to ground objective morality in something like that on the atheistic view? Something that promotes the well-being of conscious creatures through science. Okay? This is confronted by an immediate problem. This hypothesis, in fact. It's confronted by an immediate problem. Science is morally neutral. It doesn't tell you, it only tells you what is, not what you ought to do with it. And this distinction is called the is-ought distinction in moral philosophy. And this distinction is critical, okay? It only tells you the facts of what that thing does, what that material object does, right? It doesn't tell you what you should or ought to do with that thing. Does this make sense? The is-ought distinction. Is this point clear? Yes. Okay, great. For example, take a nuclear bomb. Science can tell you what that thing does. I don't know exactly how it works, but it's something like uranium is getting crushed at such rapid and powerful force that it explodes outwards, right, in tremendous energy and force. Something like that. So science can tell you what that thing does. Does this make sense? It can tell you the resulting effects if it hits land or if it hits human beings, what it does, right? You evaporate, right? What's this thing does. But what it doesn't tell you is if you should use it or not, or you have to use it or not. Does this make sense? It doesn't tell you that you ought to use this. Scientists can do that because they are moral agents, but science by itself does not tell you if you should use it or not. The is-ought distinction, remember. Does this make sense? Great. Okay. So this is the is-ought distinction in moral philosophy, and it's critical. So it would follow immediately that objective moral values and duties cannot exist on a purely atheistic worldview. Right? Case in point, Richard Dawkins states, a famous atheist, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Another atheist, a more scholarly atheist, says, Michael Roos, he states, he's also a moral philosopher, he states, morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. So on the atheistic view, we are just animals for propagating DNA and have no moral obligations to one another. On this view, although actions like rape or murder are not societally advantageous, it has no basis to show that rape or murder is objectively wrong. Does that make sense? It has no basis, right? In fact, rape and murder goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. The rapist who goes against the social norm is doing nothing more seriously than acting unfavorably. Again, it's just your opinion versus theirs, right? And I did not make that slide, okay? It's not me who made that slide. There was someone else who helped me on this, and they made that slide, okay? So I don't take credit for that slide. But, so on the atheistic framework, as we are just amoral animals, there's nothing objectively wrong with lying, stealing, cheating, coveting, injustice, robbery, racism, adultery, abuse, beating, betrayal, rape, murder, slavery, child sex trafficking, abortion, genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass starvation, holocausts, and etc. On atheism, again, since there is no objective moral foundation, there's nothing objectively wrong with all of these. It's just, again, it's just your opinion versus theirs. Does this make sense? Again, those are the pairs of shoes. But as we've seen in the previous slides, objective moral values and duties clearly do exist. Philosophers who reflect upon our moral senses argue that just as I believe my five senses, senses such as like sight or smell or taste and things like that, okay? Just as I intuitively believe those senses, we should similarly believe those moral senses that we have, namely that something is right or wrong, good or evil. Does this make sense? any reason that we have to distrust those senses must be exceedingly powerful to override that initial belief. Does that make sense? For example, let's take sight, for example. You must have a really good reason to distrust your senses, right? Your sight or your smell or touch or something like that. You must have a good overriding reason that is exceptionally powerful to have doubts about your sight, right? Similarly, we should trust our moral intuitions as reliable. Again, any challenge to this view would need to prove that our moral experience is completely unreliable. However, as we've seen in previous slides, our moral sense and compass is so strong that any such challenge would need to be exceptionally powerful to override our direct moral experience. Okay, so we have seen that objective morality cannot exist on a purely atheistic worldview or framework. You see the pyramid collapse in there. So, what could this foundation be in order to ground objective morality? Well, first, this foundation must be something that is eternal or non-temporal, something that transcends time, okay? Something that is eternal in nature. This is because the objective moral law transcends culture, societal norms, and personal opinion, but is somehow binding to all cultures and societies and languages. Does that make sense? It transcends those kind of things. So this objective foundation has to be eternal or non-temporal. If it is eternal, that means it does not have a beginning. It cannot have a beginning. Does that make sense? Because it existed forever. It means that it is uncaused or necessary. It is not contingent. Okay? Thus, it must also be necessary. Yeah. Further, this foundation for objective morality must be something that is personal. Why? Personal just means like it has agency or it has it has freedom of the will, right? It has it's something that bears semblance to characteristics like ours, right? Why? Why? That's the question. Why? Think about qualities such as patience, love, justice, and courage. So think of qualities that only belong to persons. Okay? So these qualities, kind of like patience, love, justice, courage, mercy, happiness, and others, right? There's many others. Okay, do these characteristics exist in material objects? For example, do they exist in cups or rocks or tables? Does it make sense for someone to say that a table is courageous, or a rock is just, or a cup is patient? It makes no sense, right? Or does it make sense for a speaker to be loving? It makes no sense, right? What do these kind of characteristics exist in? If we think about it, these kind of moral characteristics only exist in persons or something that is personal, that bears these kinds of characteristics of morality. For example, you can say that a person is courageous, loving, and patient. You can't say the same thing for a rock, right? You can't say a rock is loving or courageous or patient. These kinds of moral characteristics only belong in persons. Does this make sense? Yes, great. It is only something that is something personal that bears these kinds of characteristics. Like this handsome man right here. Something that is personal, okay? But although he may disagree, Victor may disagree, the reality is that no finite person has actualized all moral value. Does that make sense? There's no one who achieved the height of moral perfection. I know in our doctrine we will say that, but the question, does God exist, okay? There is no one who has reached the height of perfection or all moral value. The moral ideal is nowhere fully actualized in the finite world, while still being binding in the finite world. But how can something be objective and valid if it does not exist? Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Come on. Okay, yes. So we have seen that objective morality must be grounded in something that is eternal, necessary, and personal. Right? We concluded that, right? Yes. If the moral ideal is to be valid for reality, it must be fully realized in an existent that is eternal, necessary, and personal. Again, what kind of criteria, what kind of thing fits into that criteria? It needs to be something that is personal. For example, again, mathematics, numbers are eternal and necessary, but they're not personal, right? They don't have moral agency. They can't, for example, you can't say the number 9 is courageous or loving, right? So only something like an immaterial mind that transcends both time and space fits into that kind of criteria. That is God, right? What we traditionally attribute as an immaterial mind. So that is the third argument for God's existence, the moral argument, arguing that because there's an objective foundation because there's objective morality, there must be some kind of foundation that undergirds that objective morality. So, conclusion. Today we first saw that the universe began to exist. And how did we see that? We saw that through, number 1, a philosophical argument that an infinite number of past events is not possible. Right? That was the first reason. The second reason was that the universe is expanding, a scientific argument. And thirdly, the second law, the SLT. That proved that the universe had to begin to exist because it has a limited number of life. So from this, we concluded, this conclusion that the universe began to exist, that whatever created the universe had to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused or necessary, powerful, and personal, what we call God. Then we took a look at the fine-tuning argument and concluded that because there is fine-tuning in the universe, there must be a fine-tuner. Finally, we deduced that the existence of God is necessary for the objective standard for morality, something that is, again, necessary, eternal, or non-temporal, and personal, right? Although each of these are standalone arguments, when combined, they give the full picture of God reflected in classical theism. That is something that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, necessary, personal, supremely powerful, supremely intelligent, and the moral foundation of the universe. Right? It gives the full picture of classical theism. That makes sense, right? Yes. So, therefore, with these 3 brief arguments, I believe that there is good reasons to believe and think that God exists. Thank you very much.